I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
Today we're looking at a single poem by Du Fu. We have a whole podcast dedicated to Du Fu, but given that our podcasts are only about 30 minutes, and Du Fu is, if not the single greatest figure in Chinese literary history, at least in the top three, one 30-minute podcast is a little shabby.
Sure. There's so much that Du Fu has to offer. Stephen Owen has a 6-volume. Stephen Owen, by the way, is the sort of dean of classical Chinese literary poetry.
Translation.
That kind of stuff. Yeah, he's at Harvard now. He has just recently, I believe, published a 6-volume set of English translations along with the Chinese, so it's face-to-face, of the whole of
all of Du Fu's output.
Yeah.
That's absurd.
Yeah.
That's about like on your own recording everything Bach ever composed.
Or translating everything Shakespeare ever
wrote. Yeah, exactly.
No, it's an insane amount. You don't actually have to get the 6-volume set.
No.
It's available for free online, though if you're like me, you might have scored all 6 volumes just because you're that
Lee's bragging because he was at a conference and found... Where did you find it again?
So this guy was just like, I don't want to carry these back to Taipei with me. Can you take these?
And you went, sure. I was looking at it. I was telling Lee, I can't imagine enjoying this much of an author enough to translate everything.
So what poem are we looking at today?
We're looking at the poem On a Moonlit Night. It's an interesting thing. One of the things that you will notice... If you read much of Du Fu, he's a very melancholy poet, and not in the ultra-depressed way of, I would argue, some modern poets, but sort of a wistful yearning for other times, other places. Lots of his poems feature the poet thinking about a place that he remembers, or wishing he was someplace else, or remembering a person who's not able to be there anymore. And we mentioned his connection in the last podcast to the An Lushan Rebellion in the 750s,
right.
really, A.D., in which the then dynasty of the Tang was...
Almost completely collapsed.
Because of a rebellion. Yeah.
It's the dividing point for the Tang dynasty, which is generally considered the apex of Chinese civilization. This An Lushan Rebellion completely weakened the Tang state, and it was a sort of dividing point for all of Chinese history, maybe.
I would agree.
It's maybe, I mean, it's the end of power of Chang'an. After this, Chang'an becomes increasingly weak. Chang'an is modern day Xi'an,
which would have been the then capital of the Tang.
Right. And it would have also been the world's largest city for several centuries.
Very true.
But after the An Lushan Rebellion, that changes. I mean, power is still focused in the Tang Empire in Chang'an, but increasingly it's dispersed. And then after the Tang Dynasty, I don't believe there is any dynasty that has power in Chang'an.
And really, this is all important to know because Du Fu was displaced by all the violence.
And the poem that we're going to look at today is sort of not only about displacement, but it's written while he's being displaced, right?
He has a lot of poems where he's wandering in exile. He was in exile with his wife and child, and then also on his own, he was trying to get back to the new court.
And he's exiled by that An Lushan Rebellion. I think the poem we looked at in our last podcast was him...
Meeting with a prince in the street
who is being hunted and going to be killed by some of the An Lushan rebels.
Yes, and I want to point out before we even read the poem, too, how remarkable it is that Du Fu's poetry walks this perfect line between historical detail and personal reflection. It is really remarkable because you can read it and... in order to understand really a lot of what's going on, you have to know what's happening historically and culturally. However, there's a personal voice that goes through this where even if you don't know exactly what's happening with the historical context, you will be able to appreciate what he's dealing with. So The translation of the poem that we're working with is by David Hawkes, Hawkes.
And we've referenced David Hawkes before. He has an amazing book called A Little Primer on Dufu.
And it's spelled Tufu, Tufu. And I really have to make a huge plug for this book. It's not a particularly long book. It's remarkable how much he packs into about 200 pages. If you have any interest in Chinese culture and history, you have to read this book. I'm not exaggerating.
It's not really, I wouldn't say read it necessarily, but it's a great reference for anyone who's interested in thinking about Chinese poetry, because it goes through it. So explicates each of the poems, and so much of the problem with reading Chinese poetry is you don't have this kind of historical explication that you need to really approach it, and this book offers that to the English reader.
Offers you the history, but it also offers, I think, the best translations of Dufu, because when I read, we mentioned this in the last podcast, but when I read Chinese classical poetry, I think in terms of prose poetry. It's the way it feels to me. And Hawkes translates it that way. He translates it as prose poetry. He translates it in a sort of a prose form. So let's just read it real quick, and then we can get into some more detail. So it's not a particularly long one. The full translation is, "Thinking of my brothers on a moonlit night. Travel is interrupted by the war drums of the garrisons. The sound of a solitary wild goose announces the coming of autumn to the frontier. From tonight onwards, the dew will be white. The moon is that same moon which shines down on my birthplace. My brothers are scattered in different places. I have no home to tell me whether they are alive or dead. The letters we write never seem to reach their destination, and it will be worse now that we are at war once more." So there's so much to talk about in this poem.
Can we maybe just unpack it? What's going on, kind of contextually?
Sure.
Where things are at.
Mm-hmm.
So Dufu is in the far western part of China, and what would today be somewhere in Gansu. He's in one of the kind of garrison cities, the border cities on the edge there. I believe that the An Lushan Rebellion did not affect these areas as much as it would have places in other parts of China. Mm-hmm. An Lushan is he is a Central Asian who is actually invading from the north and the east. He took Luoyang first. So Luoyang is sometimes called the eastern capital. It's a very important city in modern-day Henan. It was, for certain periods of time, the capital of the Tang Dynasty, particularly during Empresses Wu Zetian's reign. I believe she made her capital there mostly. But the western part of China, I don't think, was affected, but he's still got all of this kind of family scattered around the Tang Empire. So he's looking at this breakdown of communication, and he's on the very edge of this polity, and he's trying to figure out, what's happening? How do the things that matter most to me, my family relationships, what's going on with this? So it's I think you pointed out, a very personal kind of evocation of things, but it's also very much concerned with state building, right? Mm-hmm. It's about the post and letters getting through.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you have an example of a division of the personal and perhaps the political in a single image. And this is true of a lot of Dufu's poems, where the intentional contrast between just two simple terms can lead to pages of writing. He mentions, for example, in one line, "gu xiang," which is, I guess we would translate it more like home county or hometown.
Home place.
It can be very personal, but it's not as personal as the jia, which is home, which is family.
And there have been books written on this concept. It's I would argue, a uniquely Chinese concept. Not that other cultures don't have things like gushang, but it's very, the gushang is very specific, and the parameters of the gushang are very kind of specific to Chinese culture.
And so there's an interesting connection then between, he has the line, David Hawkes has the line, "The moon is that same moon which shines down on my birthplace." But then 2 lines later, he says, "I have no home to tell me whether they," meaning his brothers, "are alive or dead." Well, if he has a birthplace, surely he has a home. But he's making a contrast between 故乡, which is the place I was born,
Right.
and 家, which is where the family would be concentrated.
家 would be more of referring to family as people, right? Like you can say your 家人 in Chinese. That's literally your family. So 家 here, is it talking about the people, or is it talking about? I was thinking that 故乡 was more referring to the specific spot, the area, whereas 家 is more about person.
That's really the contrast I was shooting for, because like Lee mentioned, there is this contrast between someone reflecting on the political state of affairs and how it impinges on the personal, because he realizes that he still has a birthplace. There is still a place that recognizes his physical birth, his political presence in the empire as a citizen, or as a whatever subject. I think that would be more the word, not citizen. But he has no home. Now, home as a geographical location, that wouldn't make sense, because clearly he has a place that he's from. But home as a collection of family that has all been broken up and scattered. They're not where they were anymore. And so
it's not entirely that he doesn't have a family, right? Like he just doesn't know what is the state of his family. So
and this is also an interesting thing. You just mentioned that, but I find that interesting because as sort of modern, especially American readers, we're sort of we're wanderers, really. I mean,
says the man who spent his high school in
Jordan, in the Middle East. No, it's true, though. I mean, the vast majority of Americans, if you said, we should all of us live close to our families, most Americans would be like, why? Yeah. Is there a good job there? Who cares? For so many other cultures, it would be unthinkable to live hundreds and hundreds of miles from your family. And so the idea of home being a thing or a place is not necessarily a feature of at least this part of Chinese culture. Home is where your family, the collective group, is. It isn't where your parents live and everyone else lives somewhere else. That doesn't count. It has to be a place where you are remembered, where you have things passed down, where people they gather and meet and are together. And so, as Lee mentioned, jia in Chinese is not literally. It's not exactly a place. It's the people. It's
the family. Yeah. It really probably more borders on translating it as family.
Right. It's closer to that. Although I do agree with her. This is an example of why I think David Hawkes he's dead now, I think, a remarkable translator, because you could feasibly translate jia as family, because it is personified here. I have no home to tell me whether they are alive or dead. They meaning his brothers. But he translates it as home to intentionally pair it with or contrast it against 故乡, which is birthplace. Instead of having a person versus a place, he's a place versus a place.
I just wanted to point out, I'm thinking a little bit about gender in Chinese. The thing that he is concerned about are his brothers. There's no sense of kind of importance of feminine in this. And I just think that's interesting. The title is 月夜一世地. So that's on the Moonlight Night, I think of my brothers, or I think of my family. Brothers is kind of like brothers as meaning family, which is interesting of itself. And the kind of time, so line 5 is 有地皆分散. So I have brothers, but they're all separated.
San always means separated from something, scattered, really.
Hawkes translates it as my brothers are scattered in different places. So there's this interesting kind of thing. He's thinking specifically in terms of in very gendered terms.
Yeah, that too. And this is an interesting thing to think about, because it's a very stark poem. We'll talk a lot more in a future podcast about figurative language in Chinese poetry, because it's not true that there isn't, as some critics claim, any figurative language in classical Chinese poetry. But it is much simpler and much more streamlined. And in this one, for example, you have the image in one of the lines, as Hawkes translates it, the sound of a solitary wild goose announces the coming of autumn to the frontier. Now, you don't need to know really much besides that. You can appreciate that line exactly for what it is. It's an image that's very poignant, even if you don't know that, as Hawks mentions in his commentary, that the autumn goose, or the wild goose rather, was usually seen as a symbol of the waning of the year, and also was a symbol of letters being sent, an exile's letter especially. And that makes it perhaps richer, but you don't need to know that necessarily.
Right. So one thing we were talking about before with figurative language and metaphor is that, metaphor is not really a very important, it's not as important maybe in Chinese poetry as in, let's say, English poetry. But I don't know, like the thing you were saying about the kind of connection between the personal and the political, that to me seems like a kind of metaphorical language. It's much more drawn out than something that I would normally expect in English poetry, but the way that his family is scattered, it seems like itself a kind of metaphor for the political state, right?
The difference between a symbol and a metaphor, the scattered family can be a symbol for the scattered empire, but in order for it to be a metaphor, those two terms are not going to be able to coexist on the same. You can't have a poem about a family and also it's a poem about the state if it's metaphorical. One substitutes for the other and either effaces it or changes it in such a way that it cannot hold its original meaning anymore.
You don't think that's going on here?
I don't. No, I don't read it that way. But I should point out, though, one of the reasons I don't read it that way is because it's a remarkably poignant poem without having any symbols or any metaphors at work.
Except for maybe the geese.
Well, but is the wild goose here a metaphor? Because in order for it to be a metaphor, you've got to have a pair of terms working. It can't just be wild goose. Like I say, it could be a symbol, and is, but it's not necessarily a metaphor.
Okay.
There's a sense in which metaphor allows the reader to participate in the way the language functions, right? Because the reader's sort of psychological participation actually affects the meaning of the poem. In this one, though, the wild goose already has a fixed meaning in the particular literary discussions that are taking place.
So that's the sort of like end of the year kind of thing that you were talking about that Hawks mentions. Right.
And just as he talks about, for example, also, from tonight onwards, the dew will be white. Well, white dew is a I don't know if it's an official term, but it's at least an official image of the progression of autumn after the Mid-Autumn Festival.
So that would be a symbol, right? Not a metaphor.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, but it's an official referent, right? I mean, you could read a ton into this white dew if you want, but at least in the context of how Du Fu is writing, it is very easy, not very easy, but it's very possible to unpack concretely exactly what he's referring to.
So what is he exactly he's referring to? He's referring to kind of the period after the Mid-Autumn Festival?
Yes.
Okay, so my Freudian reading that I like to bring to everything is not going to work here. Is that correct?
Well, but and this should actually be a future podcast.
Don't acknowledge that, please.
No,
please don't.
Well, I was going to say this should be a future podcast just because there is a tradition in which you don't read Tang poetry just kind of the way you want. There is a way to read Tang poetry. There is not. Even for as much as I enjoy people like David Hawkes and Stephen Owen, Du Fu is, at least according to them, referring to clear things. You can't read white dew as
saying clear things. You're referring to very concrete objects within the poem.
They can be historically verified. Okay. If you, with enough literary scholarship, you can unpack the whole thing. A purely personal reading, I think white dew really strikes me as being this kind of thing that doesn't work in a lot of the old school scholarship.
So what it seems like we're coming up here is you and I are kind of trained in this romantic tradition of reading things however it makes us feel.
Exactly.
That's what a poem is about. It's what this makes me feel.
That's what you're feeling.
But that's something that's very not happening in this poem, and something that doesn't really work in a lot of the Chinese context, even in a lot of modern Chinese scholarship on poetry, right?
Right, and but this is the thing too, is that if you if you present a reading of someone as canonical as Du Fu, well argued, that differs entirely with this sort of historical cultural interpretation, you're not getting published. It's not going to happen. But what I wanted to...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Would it happen in the United States, or would it happen... I mean,
I don't think it would happen anywhere.
Really? Okay.
I don't... And maybe I'm just too much a novice, but I don't see a lot of innovation happening in classical poetic scholarship. You have to sort of prove your street cred by being able to do this kind of philology.
Okay.
But, what I wanted to settle on, at least for me, you offer your own sort of feedback on this, but the English translations I've just read, if you knew nothing about sinological scholarship, especially on poetry, if you knew nothing about the Anlushan Rebellion, would still be very striking and very moving. Lines like, "I have no home to tell me whether they are alive or dead," is a very moving line. It's extremely relatable. And so, for me, this is one of the reasons I keep coming back to Du Fu, one of the reasons he always interests me. And one of the reasons I think people are still reading him in China is because he combines this awareness of what's happening around him politically in history with a deep awareness of what's happening in him and in the people he cares about. That ability to combine the two, I would argue, is really unique in Chinese history.
I think we should end it there.
All right. We will talk more about issues of figurative language in classical poetry, especially later.
Debate.
Indeed.
So, for now, I guess we've kind of...
we've nailed it. This poem is... We're done.
No, hang on now. I think we've... Did we just do the Du Fu? This podcast was brought to you by Mountain Dew.
Do the Du Fu. Do you think we can get corporate sponsorship with that? I don't know. This is like the kind of thing they would want to sponsor.
As our podcast becomes more and more popular.
Yeah, it is. It is going to... I think it's going to reach the 1 million download mark soon?
Maybe 2 or 3 million by the end of the year.
Okay, that's great. I was really hoping that would be the case.
All right. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.